Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. My name is Debbie Kay. I'm the League president. The League is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors an opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and the well-being of our communities. The League is grateful for support from the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund, the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation, and our media partner, Metro East Community Media. They record our community education panels, candidate ballot measure forums, and video voters guide, and rebroadcast them on community access channels, social media, and also podcasts. Please tell your friends, family, and colleagues to watch this video and podcast, which will be posted on our website, lwvpdx.org, by early next week. As you know, mental health and homelessness are huge issues in our community and integrally related. We hope that by discussing them together in this panel, additional knowledge will promote new ideas and solutions. We sincerely thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. Our moderator, and also a panelist for tonight's program, is our esteemed colleague, Jason Renaud, LWV PDX League member and voluntary managing director of the Mental Health Association of Portland. Jason, please go ahead.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Our expert panelists will discuss chronic homelessness as a public health issue. They'll explain how they are trying to provide healthcare and shelter to people with mental illness and/or addiction, and the need for more shelters and supportive housing for people who are low income. First, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Jill Connor. She is a certified alcohol and drug counselor who is recently retired from Central City Concern. Jill, can you please start us off by providing your thoughts about persons who are homeless and adrift and the high prevalence we see here in Portland of mental illness and addiction for both adults and youth?
Well, first, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for even discussing this topic. I think it's wonderful. I think the more information we can get out there about this, the better. And I really appreciate being asked to speak here. I'd like to start by saying that I think it's a pretty big challenge for me to try to sum up everything that I have to say, and decades of experience, both personally and professionally, with homelessness and addiction and mental health and criminality in 8 to 10 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I also want to say that I have very strong feelings about this. I'm really passionate about this. I've been watching people die from this for decades, and it breaks my heart. And so I have some strong opinions that not everybody might agree with, but here we go. So for the first thing I'd like to do, I'd like to read something that describes addiction a bit. It says, our disease isolated us from people except when we were getting, using, and finding ways and means to get more. Hostile, resentful, self-centered, and self-seeking, we cut ourselves off from the outside world. Our world shrank and isolation became our way of life. We used in order to survive. We were caught in the grip of our disease. We were forced to survive any way that we could. We manipulated people and tried to control everything around us. We lied, stole, cheated, and sold ourselves. We had to have drugs regardless of the cost. Failure and fear began to invade our lives. Higher mental and emotional functions such as conscience and the ability to love were sharply affected by our use of drugs. Living skills were reduced to the animal level. Our spirit was broken. The capacity to feel human was lost. This seems extreme, but many of us have been in this state of mind. And even when others told us that we had a problem, we were convinced that we were right and the world was wrong. And we used this belief to justify our self-destructive behavior. We developed a point of view that enabled us to pursue our addiction without concern for our own well-being or the well-being of others. And I know that that sounds pretty drastic, but in my experience, addiction goes hand in hand with homelessness. The prevalence of criminality, the prevalence of addiction, the high prevalence of mental health in homelessness, they all go hand in hand with each other. So a little bit of my story, I'm an addict in recovery. I experienced homelessness out there. The thing about the disease of addiction is that it manifests itself in a lot of ways that don't have anything to do with substances. But obviously I had to get the substances out of the way before I could deal with any of the other issues. And that was extraordinarily challenging. The first time I experienced homelessness, my husband and I lived in an abandoned house with our 2-year-old. With rats, with no running water. Somebody had managed to turn the electricity on, so we had that. Now you'd think logically a person would look at that and say, holy smokes, there's something wrong here. I better do something about it. But the thing about addiction is you're operating, first of all, you're operating out of a mindset that's engulfed in substances. So you're not thinking clearly anyway, but it's insidious. To me, it's a form of insanity that drives you to look at things in a very skewed way, and it rationalizes and justifies. And, you know, I started out from a functional household, and in telling my story, I'm not just telling my story, I'm telling the story of thousands of people. I'm not unique. Started out dabbling with some things in high school, and I crossed a series of little lines, just a little thing, just a little something I knew I wasn't supposed to do. And then it was another little thing and another little thing and another little thing and another little thing. And it was a progression that started here and ended here, that ended, not even ended with me in that abandoned house. I continued using for years after that. And in the end, when I finally was willing to make that change, and my belief and my experience is that something has to precipitate that change for people. Some event has to happen. For me, the event was I was about to lose my children. I cannot tell you, and I know this is not a popular opinion, but I believe that jail saves lives. I believe prison saves lives. I believe people being mandated to treatment saves lives. I have time and time and time again, personally and professionally, dealt with people who make the remark, the day that I was arrested, I was so relieved that somebody finally stopped me. Or if I hadn't gone to prison, I'd be dead. Or thank God I went to jail and I had time to clear my head and make some different decisions, because that disease, like I say, it just skews our thinking. We have an inability to make healthy choices for ourselves. And the progression just gets worse and worse until, you know, I felt so isolated. And what I really needed to find was some other people that I could relate to, but the people that I'd been relating to were all using, and I didn't know where these other people would be. And in the end, as I say, what precipitated my leaving was I was going to lose my kids. So I took my children and I left and lived in the car with my kids. There was nowhere that I could go to treatment then. I didn't know anybody who was clean. My family was dead. I tried to get in a shelter unsuccessfully, and then the car got impounded, so then I didn't even have the car. Fortunately, I was able to find a little studio apartment that I could afford with my welfare check and these 2 kids, what I don't think could happen today. You know, I don't know that I could move 2 children and a woman into a studio, let alone an affordable one. When I was on methadone at the time, I had to argue with the prescribing physician to let me off, because his written recommendation was I stay on for the rest of my life because I would never be clean. I was 31 years old, and in 4 days, I will have been clean for 34 years. So that lies dead. I just want to put that out there. So this progression, you know, the progression, not only in myself and individual addicts who are out there, but I see the progression on the streets ever since, I mean, for the last few decades, it's been getting worse and worse. The level of criminality is worse. People's mental health, their trauma is being exacerbated by the high level of violence, by the substances that are out there today, I think are so much harsher. I've just been watching a much higher level of damage. So a much higher level of people dealing with mental health issues as a result of this. And yet the mental health resources still aren't there. And there isn't any more really, there aren't really any more resources. I heard a crazy statistic the other day that said that Oregon has the second highest rate of addiction in the country. And yet we are in last place in access to treatment. So we're not doing a very good job. And the city is rampant with crime, obviously, because as I said in the beginning, they all go hand in hand. And I will also say that in 1999, there was a huge heroin overdose epidemic happening in Portland. It's very similar to the fentanyl epidemic we have going on now. And similarly, it's still just as difficult for people to get into detox. So what precipitated the beginning of this program in 99 was that a young couple tried to get into detox and couldn't, and they hung themselves off a bridge downtown. And the county decided something should happen, and CCC decided to start a program and I was lucky enough to be picked as one of 3 people to create this program, because they thought maybe people who have experienced homelessness, criminality, addiction, mental health, incarceration, and all that, maybe they have an idea about what to do. And they allowed us to create it. And there was no program of its kind at the time. It was highly successful. We had a 67% success rate. And in the beginning, it was specifically for heroin addicts. It was incredible. People from all over the country came to see what we were doing. We connected with people in detox one-on-one. We let them know that, listen, we experienced the same thing you're going through. We get where you're coming from. Now, if you really are serious about this, we'll bring you, but here's the rules. We're going to give you housing. We're going to give you everything you need. All your basic needs will be met, but we are going to expect you to attend treatment, our groups, 12-step meetings. You're not going to commit crimes. And you're not going to put your hands on people. So if you can agree to those things, we'll bring you in. And they were desperate and they were willing. And we brought them to the end of the old Danmore. They had cockroaches and mice, and they didn't care. They were just so happy to have a key to their own place. And it was an amazing time. It was really the highlight of my career. It was extraordinary. And we had so many successes. And from 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, there are still people clean today that came through that program. Over the years, especially recently, that program has changed drastically, and it's just not the same. And I don't know that there is any completely abstinence-based program similar to that anymore, sadly. But, the thing about us is that we are very resilient people. We are survivors, regardless of the trauma we experience. And like I said, it's being homeless, being an addict, you're involved with criminality. There's a lot of violence, there's shootings, there's stabbings, there's rapes, there's robbery, there's every kind of horrible, heinous activity you can think of that we come through and we make it through. So we don't need to be coddled. We don't need to be babied. We need some support. And I also believe what people need is consequences. I think it's like if you had a child just running wild, sticking their hand in the wood stove or running in the street, you can't allow that. There have to be guidelines. There have to be consequences. People need to be given hope. They need to be given support with structure, routines, and rules that are consistent and predictable. But like with the mentor program, I think that in addition to more availability to detox, and if I won the lottery, I would have a 24/7 detox. When we're in our addiction, the thought of getting clean, like we've dug ourselves this hole that is so deep, the thought of how can I get out of this? It's insurmountable. I've burned my bridges. I'm homeless. I don't have anything else I can access. I have nobody I can call. I have nowhere I can go. There's this detox place if I can get across town and be there at 7:30 in the morning, which is a huge task when you're addicted. I can tell you that. And then you make it there, but you don't get in that day. You got to come do it again tomorrow. And then maybe you have to do it a third day. It's too much to even think about. So if I won the lottery, I would have a 24/7 detox, because the thing with addiction and that insane thinking that focuses, we just find ways and means to get more. That's our driving force. That's all we can focus on. And every now and then there's a little window. There's a little moment of clarity that says, I'm tired of this. I want to do something else. If I could just get in there right then, we have to seize people, because in 3 days' time, that window might close, and that window might not open for years or decades or ever. I think it's just crucial to have access to more detox. And then where are they going to go after detox? That was part of the issue with why the mentor program started. People were leaving detox, going back to where? Going back to where they came from, which wasn't a safe place, with some address of a treatment center somewhere. They're not going to follow through. So we would get them physically from detox, take them to housing, take them to get their food, their pots and pans, some clothes, make sure all those basic needs are met, escort them to meetings, escort them to their treatment, make sure that we were with them side by side for everything they needed to do, and then hold them accountable to do it. And it was incredibly successful and wonderful. So the need is so great now. The need is so huge. I don't even know where we could start to address all these issues. And there's been very little mental health treatment all these years. That hasn't changed either. And with all of that, as I said, being exacerbated and getting worse, it's like Sisyphus. This problem is like pushing the boulder up the hill, and we make a little progress and it rolls back down. So I don't have answers to all these things, but I think it's wonderful that people are willing to have these dialogues, willing to listen, willing to sort of problem solve. And that's where some of the solutions maybe can come from, is being a little more informed. And I just appreciate being allowed to be here and talk about this. And thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for your work to help people who are experiencing mental illness and addiction, who are homeless and in trouble. Thank you for your work. Well, I'll go next. My name is Jason Renaud. I'm the board secretary of the Mental Health Association of Portland. I'm also a person in long-term recovery from alcoholism and mental illness. And I've had the good luck to be an advocate for people with these sorts of troubles for about 30 years. And I'm going to talk about the perils of not providing the health care that Jill is speaking about the consequences that Oregon and really especially Portland are now experiencing from a long period of underfunding our public mental health and addiction health systems. Now, mental illness and addiction are both chronic, lifelong disorders with recognizable symptoms and effective treatments. Both can have periods of relapse where symptoms can return, where behavior can change, and where individuals often need help from others. And we call this crisis. About half the people with severe and persistent mental illness have some level of engagement with the public health system. Some visit clinics daily, some visit only for medication refills. For some with mental illness, occasional hospitalization can be necessary. With addiction, the dramatic symptoms disappear fairly quickly when a person stops drinking or using, but they can get quite ill. So the medical detoxification that Joe is speaking of is sometimes needed, but addicts rarely, almost never require hospitalization. Now, almost doubling this problem is the lack of effective services. And that has caused many people with mental illness to turn to drugs and alcohol to treat their symptoms. And sometimes people with untreated addiction develop mental illness. So often you get people who have both of these problems. And then let's add one more to the pile, a somewhat clinical problem, trauma, something we're really just learning about in the last decade. Now, trauma results from exposure to an incident or a series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, and it has lasting adverse effects on that person's functioning mentally, physically, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and very difficult to treat. Now, research shows homelessness causes trauma to about 80% of the people who are unsheltered for a period of time. And that number, 80%, is probably higher with women, probably 100% for women. Mm-hmm. The annual cost of the national just inpatient trauma care is estimated at about $37 billion a year, and with a total cost closer to $670 billion a year when you account for the downstream medical expenditures, the disability, and the lost work productivity. That's more than the cost of tobacco. And for too many people with these illnesses, homelessness is a natural consequence of this ineffective or absent public health service. Now, each individual crisis has its own continuum, its own beginning and end. Often the beginning of a crisis isn't apparent until symptoms are fully in place. And because health providers rarely, if ever, are involved in early crisis, they often never see early symptoms. So they don't think about it, they don't prepare for it, and they don't provide services for early symptom intervention. Now, some crises take hours, some take months. The public policy question is when, in that continuum, would investment be most effective to stop the crisis? Now, you could put money early in the continuum into prevention or rent relief or jobs programs or early intervention. Now, that money has less precise outcomes. Does it work? Is it effective? Are we getting our money's worth? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Usually it's always hard to tell. No, or you could put the money at the apex of the crisis into ambulances and police and Narcan and state hospitals and jails. Now, with this number, a bookkeeper can see the dollar by the outcome. But to what end? The damage is already done. Or you could put your dollar somewhere in between the beginning and the end, somewhere useful and effective. And of course, where money is slotted is the subject of 1,000 legislative debates. That's the work of public health policy. So what's missing in all of this? Why is Oregon and Portland in such trouble right now? I'm going to name 4 factors. First and foremost is that these illnesses, even with a cooperative patient and effective medical care, are extremely hard to treat. Most addicts do not fully recover. Most people with mental illnesses do not live symptom-free. Most people with trauma do not get the help that they need. That's true here in Oregon and pretty much everywhere else. So the odds start against us. Second was a lack of federal, state, county, and city investment in both public mental health and addiction services when that problem began to accelerate in the late 1980s and 1990s. Elected leaders and their selected public administrators ignored a lot of expert advice and they put their funding elsewhere, either in other places entirely or often into ineffective and sometimes even harmful services. Third is that lack of funding didn't build the necessary infrastructure to provide the services now. It injured goodwill in the community. You can really see people moving from being compassionate towards the homeless to being just plain angry. That's happening right now. And most importantly, and maybe most destructively, it chased off a whole generation of workforce. I suspect that even if we had all the money in the world, we couldn't hire people today capable of solving this problem. And even with huge investments in the past couple of years, really throwing money at the problem here in Oregon, we're still a couple of decades behind where we should have been. So we're not getting out of this problem anytime soon. Fourth, we are still hurting ourselves. And one example of that is in 2020, Oregon deregulated drugs at the demand of industry and under the banner of decriminalization. And that caused and will continue to cause enormous damage. So how big is the problem? Well, we don't know a lot about it, to be honest. We don't know how many people who are homeless here in Portland or really anywhere. We do an annual survey, something called the point in time count, where volunteers spend a day peeking under bridges and calling shelters to find out, count everyone who's homeless. But everyone who studies the point in time count agrees that the survey is inconsistent year after year and is completely inaccurate. There is some debate about how many people who are homeless who also have mental illness and addiction. that debate swirls around definitions of homelessness, of mental illness, and of addiction. According to the last point in time count, there are about 3,000 people in Multnomah County who are both homeless and unsheltered tonight, about 3,000 people. Various national researchers put that number of homeless people who are also mentally ill or addicted, it's somewhere between 15% and 50%. So in Portland, that's somewhere between 450 people and 1,500 people. My experience doing direct care at the same agency Jill did for thousands of people who were homeless, and this was many years ago, was that if you include trauma and personality disorders, which we're not going to talk about tonight, that number, the number of people who are both homeless and ill, is about 100%. About 100%. Now, what are the costs of the problem? What are the costs of the failure to address this public health crisis? And for the moment, let's set aside the peril to human lives, the suffering, the pain, the indignity, the ugliness. I don't think we're qualified to account for that damage. But according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness in 2016, a person experiencing chronic homelessness costs the taxpayer an average of $35,000 a year. In a New York study about 20 years ago, people with severe mental illness who are also homeless, the average cost was calculated to be about $40,000 per person per year. So if we do the math, Multnomah County has 3,000 people who are homeless and unsheltered. Jason thinks that they're probably all in need of psychiatric care. So let's use that New York number of $40,000 each. That's about $120 million per year. But I think that's a low estimate because last year the county and the city, Multnomah County and the city of Portland, jointly funded the Joint Office of Homeless Services about $255 million. So the problem is expensive. The problem is complicated. The problem is persistent. Let me switch gears for my remaining time and talk about police, because this is a special problem in Portland. I think most of you know the story, but after 2012 investigation of the Portland Police Bureau, the US DOJ found that our police have a pattern and practice of harming people with mental illness. Our organization looked at all the publicly available police use of force cases going back to 1970 and found that over time, 72% of those shot and killed by police were affected by mental illness or addiction. Since the US DOJ arrived a decade ago and awareness has increased in the media and with the police, that number has actually increased to 100%. Over the last decade, it's been 100%. And now, after years and years of new training, of workforce turnover, of leadership turnover, of practice review and revision of policy, and of compliance now with nearly 200 of these items in this vast settlement agreement, 2022 was a record year with 9 people killed by the Portland police. And I think that all of them had mental illness or addiction in some form or another. And for the numbers people out there, these are very weird numbers because they're very small. 9 people killed out of tens of thousands of contacts. So it's a very variable number. Because here we see in 2023, and we're in April already, and there have been none. No deaths in 2023 caused by police. The costs beside death and misery is the injury to the credibility of the police. And even with new ideas we're having in Portland about alternative outreach teams, people with mental illness and addiction are still highly reliant on the police in crisis. We haven't really built the system, the alternative system. We're just starting with Portland Street Response and several other kinds of outreach programs, but they're not fully in place yet. So what's the solution to this mess? There are 2 solutions: help people get effective services and help people get sustainable housing. And to speak to those two solutions, I'm going to first turn to Scott Kerman of Blanchet House, and then to Rachel Duke of Community Partners for Affordable Housing. Scott, are you ready?
I am ready, Jason. Thank you. And thank you, Jason and Jill, for kicking us off tonight. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this event and inviting me here today. I should say at the outset, in contrast to Jason and Jill, I am not in recovery, but I do work with people in recovery and people with mental illness and people with housing insecurity and food insecurity and unsheltered homelessness each and every day. And so that's what I'll speak to today. I'm going to share my screen. So if you can indulge me a second to get this set up. I am Scott Kerman. I'm the executive director of Blanchet House and Farm. And for 71 years in the Old Town district of Portland, Blanchet House has served free meals to anybody who wants one. 71 years ago, that was largely men with a lot of unemployment, a lot of houselessness, and a lot of hunger. And back in those days, it was almost entirely alcoholism that they were confronting. Of course, over the 7 decades that Blanchet House has been serving, we've seen a lot of change, and we're certainly experiencing a pretty frightening moment right now. I think everybody who's taken the time to join us tonight is aware of, I think Jill called it an epidemic. The fentanyl epidemic, the methamphetamine epidemic in our community, especially people who are using what is known as P2P meth, which is a particularly strong and potent and dangerous version of methamphetamine. And to speak to the fentanyl epidemic, you likely saw the news story that just last Friday, in a single day, the Portland police responded to 11 overdoses in the downtown corridor. Speaking for Blanchet House, in a 1-week period that just concluded, we had 7 overdoses right on our sidewalk or across the street from where we serve. And Blanchet House staff were fortunate to leap to those emergencies and revived people. 5 of those individuals, and the other 2 were revived by a rapid response that was also in the neighborhood. And so this is really a life-threatening situation that we're dealing with. And for us, we're about changing lives. And if that requires us to save lives, then that's what we're going to do. So I don't know how much I can add to what Jill and Jason spoke to the seriousness of mental illness and addiction and trauma. And I think all of those things are at play in the population that we serve. What we try to do is offer a reason for folks to hope. And so this is a shot of our Founders Cafe where we serve our meals. And if you've never been down to Blanchet House to serve meals, I'll explain what you're looking at. It's a large, bright, and airy space with a lot of room for people. We serve at tables for 4. We think that breeds a certain intimacy and community. It's a lot less lonely than perhaps eating at a larger table or even a long picnic table. And we serve it restaurant style. We tell folks which table to sit at. You can see, for instance, this gentleman is sitting at blue 4. If I'm reading the number correctly. And then we have volunteers and staff who are serving plated dishes. And then we have volunteers walking around serving beverages and volunteers walking around bussing the tables. We're a house of hospitality. And so that means that the people who come to us for service are our guests. And so we want to treat them as guests. And really, it's about showing them dignity. And hopefully, by coming to us day after day, as many of them do, 3 times a day, 6 days a week, they begin to believe that they're not worthless, that people do care about them, that they do matter. And that is critical, because if they don't have that sense of self, because they really do not, they have a lot of shame and they have a lot of negative experience in their life where they've been told and made to feel that they are worthless and they are invisible. And so, we've heard from people who come to eat with us that, eating at Blanchet House makes them feel normal again. It's important to remember that for the people that we see in our community who are unsheltered. They had lives, you know. Jill talked about, you know, the incremental steps that she took to where she ended up. And I'm sure if Jill went back even farther, there was a life there. And so it's important for the people that we serve to remind them that they still have a lot of life left. Part of this, of course, is, you know, when people in need, they need, you know, not just food, but we need to care for their basic needs. And so, you know, we provide them hygiene and care kits, clothing. We have shoe boutiques and clothing boutiques, and they're all designed to, again, create a sense of dignity, allowing them to have choice. And that's so important because they have to feel like a human being. And if they don't feel like a human being, then they're not going to take the next step, which we hope is perhaps inquiring about our housing program or another housing program. And to facilitate that, we have peer support. And so we have a photo here on the left side of my screen, at least, two of our peer support mentors who are just meeting with and talking with and assisting people who come into our space. We've had to add a lot of services since before the pandemic because we realized as we worked through the pandemic and reopened our indoor dining in May of 2022, that meals wasn't enough. They weren't enough anymore. And that's because the level of mental illness and addiction that we were seeing in the community we were feeding was so much significantly higher. And I think it would be wrong to say that everybody who comes to us for services is struggling with mental illness. Indeed, we serve a lot of meals to people who are sheltered, who live in shelters in the Old Town District or low-income housing, and they're food insecure, or they may not have the ability to make meals for themselves, or frankly, it's just a lot less lonely to come to Blanchet House or maybe go to the Rescue Mission or Union Gospel Mission and have a meal. But certainly for the people who are unsheltered, the trauma and the disgrace and the inhumanity and the depravity of what they've experienced in the past 3 years, and especially in 2020 and 2021, which are really indescribable in terms of what people were contending with, really did for many of the people we serve, put them in a deep, dark hole in terms of their well-being, their physical health, their mental illness, and then unfortunately, their addiction to really profound and dangerous substances. I really like the picture of the father and the son. We don't see a lot of children at Blanchet House. Old Town is not exactly the best place to be if you're a family, if you're unsheltered or food insecure. But interestingly, in the last month or so, we've seen an increase in families who are coming to us. Could that be a result of the reduction in SNAP benefits that occurred at the beginning of March? We don't know. But it's important to realize how all of these things can play a role in what we're seeing in our community, in the need that we're seeing in our community. And so a reduction in food benefits puts an additional stress on people, and certainly an additional stress on family, and that can exacerbate their trauma, and sometimes it could surface mental illness or personality disorder, and lead to greater needs. But let's talk about the housing program. So in Old Town, Blanchet House provides housing for up to 45 men. It's what you refer to as a high bar program, which means there is a great deal of accountability. It's a sober environment. Not all of the men in our program are challenged with addiction, but many of them are. And as a result, we want it to be a sober environment. And we have case management and peer support and try to provide all the support they need. It's a unique program in our community because it's long. It's 9 months long with an additional 9 months if someone graduates into the third phase of the program. And what's important about that is that folks need time. And we're certainly seeing with the type of individuals who are asking to come into our housing program now, that the level of mental illness and the level of trauma and the level of need is higher than it was even 5 years ago and certainly 10 years ago. And so it takes a long time It takes a long time for the men to settle in, to become accustomed to their new environment, to learn what it means to be sheltered, to bathe regularly, to eat well, to get their sleep schedule back on track. So many things that they have to relearn. And I think Jill said, one thing that people with addiction and certainly people with lived experience with homelessness is not a track record of making healthy choices and making healthy decisions. And so it's important to give them time and structure and support to work through that process where they can make healthy decisions for themselves again. Part of that is giving them a sense of purpose. And so for the first 3 months that they're in our program, they're working in our kitchen, they're participating in our meal service. It gives them a schedule. If you're in the breakfast shift and you're living in our residence, and we got to get down there at 5 a.m. And if you're not down there on time, if you oversleep, well, then, the other guys are going to let you know because they ended up doing your work. And so it does help create a community, and we hope that it helps to build the soft skills so that after the 3 months that they're serving in our kitchen, they're really prepared to be successful with a job outside of Blanchet House. And that's really what the program is designed to do, is to help people get back on their feet. And so that means getting a job, or perhaps for some, it's going to school or getting training. And because we're not charging for any of our services, it's an opportunity to stabilize in employment, save money, and continue to work on the things that they want to work on. But they will speak to the fact that serving in our meal service program does give them a sense of purpose, a reason to get up, an opportunity to be on the other side of things for a while, because many of them have been, with Blanchet House getting meals, or they've gotten meals at other places in the city, or perhaps somewhere else outside of Oregon or outside of Portland. And so the chance to serve a need instead of be served can be really profound for the people that we serve. I want to go about an hour west of Blanchet House and talk about Blanchet Farm. And this is a component of our program that not many people in our community know about. So Blanchet Farm is out in Carlton, which is just outside of Newburgh. We have 60 acres. We've owned this property since 1962, and it's a working farm. But what's unique about this program is that it's a transitional recovery program for people with addiction. So as I said a moment ago, not everybody in the Old Town program is an addict, but everyone at Blanchet Farm has addiction. And by and large, it's a substance addiction. And they may have some other issues, some other mental illness or other personality disorder issues, but addiction is what unites them. And so it's a peer-supported 12-step community. And what's unique about this recovery program is, as you can see, they're working at the farm. And so they're working with our animals. We have pigs and chickens and goats and geese and ducks and dogs. It's all for therapeutic. We don't slaughter any of our animals. We collect the eggs from the chicken, but otherwise the animals are there really for therapeutic purposes. And, I think I'm going back to what Jill said, because she covered this so well. Being an addict is a lot of things. And one of the things is it's a very selfish experience. And I don't say that to be cruel. It's just to make a point that when you're in the throes of an addiction, what's most important to you is that addiction and feeding that addiction. And that's why for so many people who struggle with addiction, they burn through their relationships, their families, and their friends. And so for the men who come to Blanchet Farm, caring for the animals is the first opportunity that they've had in a long time to care for something outside of themselves. And I'm sure everybody here who has a pet or has spent time with animals understand the therapeutic experience of loving and being loved by an animal in our lives. And that's certainly true of the experience that the men have at the farm. It's certainly a very extraordinary experience when one of our sows is having piglets. because that's a 24-hour, that's a 24-hour or longer labor, and it's not an easy thing. A 500-pound sow giving birth is a frightening and dangerous experience, and the guys are in there doing things that they probably never expected that they do. We even have stories of guys giving piglets mouth-to-mouth resuscitation because sometimes the piglets are smothered by the sow or they're not breathing. And if I can tell a quick story, one individual at the farm, I'll just call him B. He was telling me a story about, in addition to the addiction, in addition to alcohol, his demon in his life was anger. He called himself an angry guy. And he realized that the pigs didn't want anything to do with him when he was coming to them with all that anger. And so he realized if he was going to care for the pigs, and it's something he really wanted to do, he had to control that anger. He really had to center himself and calm himself. And it worked. And then the light bulb went off. And he realized, oh, this was how his family and his friends were reacting to him. It wasn't that they didn't want to be near him. It wasn't that they didn't love or care for him. It was that the anger that he carried with himself all the time was pushing them away, just as it was pushing off the pigs. And so we're really proud of this program. And you can see we also have a beekeeping program. You can imagine the confidence that instills in residents. Those are residents in the beekeeping suits. We have a wood shop where they can be creative and do things with their hands. And then it's about peers being together. And it's about guys with addiction of different ages and different life experiences sharing and caring for one another. And sometimes it's an older individual taking a younger kid under his wing and saying, let me tell you about my story. And let me tell you about why you should take this program seriously. And, when I think about mental illness, as I've been talking about addiction, I just wonder, I just wish if I had a magic wand, I would create other places like Blanchet Farm, because I think for people with trauma, with people with mental illness, it doesn't have to be addiction. It's a place that doesn't look like an institution. It doesn't feel like an institution. It's natural. You can breathe. You can do things. You can work with your hands. You can be creative. I think about what they have in the Netherlands. They call them dementia villages, which are there to care for people who need memory care. And when I hear what those are described like, they sound to me like Blanchet Farm, even though they're not necessarily farms. And so I think as we think about solutions, we understand people need care, and many of the people need 24/7 care. And they might need it perhaps, you hope not, but maybe for the rest of their lives. And we're just not set up to provide that care, certainly not in the state of Oregon. And so I'm just hopeful as we think about solutions, and as policymakers think about solutions, we think outside the box, and we realize that there can be deinstitutionalized places where people can get the medical care and the mental health care and the support that they need so that they can have a better life. And that's really what it's all about. So with that, I'll conclude, and I'll swing it back to you, Jason.
Well, thanks, Scott. That's great. I really appreciate hearing about Blanchet House and that 70-year history of service to the community. Thanks for providing shelter to all those folks with mental illness and addiction. Next is Rachel Duke. I've been friends with Rachel forever. She's the executive director of the Community Partners for Affordable Housing. And Rachel, you're going to discuss how a person moves from shelter into long-term housing, or transitional housing, or permanent supportive housing, and what success in housing looks like.
Yes, that's my goal, to talk about those things. And first, I just want to say how great it is to be here with the League of Women Voters, and with Jason and Jill and Scott. I feel I'm excited about the conversation that we're having, and we'll have after I'm done talking. My name is Rachel Duke. I'm the executive director at Community Partners for Affordable Housing. But before I talk about that, I want to talk a little bit about myself for just a minute. I have been with SEPA for 7.5 years. And before I worked at SEPA, I worked at the Housing Authority of Portland, also known as Home Forward, for about 15 years. before I worked there, that's when I met Jason. I think I've known Jason about 30, almost 30, I don't know, a long time, so long. Anyway, when I was at Home Forward, I developed some experience working at integrating housing and healthcare together, really focused on folks who are exiting homelessness. I did a lot of work in the area of supportive housing, and I wanted to define supportive housing because we've talked about it a little bit tonight. I'm going to use the definition I use. And it's really, when I think of supportive housing, I'm thinking of housing that includes services and the actual housing itself, and also a rent subsidy. When I think of supportive housing, I think of housing that if you live there, you're there because you need the services that are being offered in order to be successful at housing. And you really also need the housing in order to be successful at using those services. And when I think about the rent subsidy, I am thinking about the kind that's based on your income, so that you're only going to be paying 30% of your income for rent. So if you move in and you have no income, you have no rent. If you have Social Security, your rent's going to be under $200 a month. And really, this is housing that's for the folks that we're talking about this evening. And so it's a good definition, I think, to hold in your mind as we talk about it today. SEPA, where I work now, we do 5 things. We build affordable housing. We provide a wide range of services to our residents. We asset manage the housing, meaning we are responsible for that housing forever after we build it. And so we have to take really good care of it. Also, we have to make sure we're in compliance with the bazillion funding sources that came in to make that housing happen. We consider ourselves advocates for housing justice. So we participate a lot in the different communities that we serve, which are primarily in Washington County and Southwest Portland. And we recently actually started providing homeless services, helping people move into housing who are living outside. And we do that in Washington County for Washington County. So those are the 5 things that we're doing. And our resident services really, again, as I said, kind of a wide range. So we do after school care for kids and, we're helping with homework. We do work with seniors so that they can stay successfully housed. And we have a big focus on helping people stay housed. We call it eviction prevention. And that means that we're doing a lot of work when there's lease enforcement issues or lease violations, so that we're helping people be successful and not have to leave the housing. Over the last few years, as I've been there, SEPA has become increasingly engaged in intentionally providing housing for people who are exiting homelessness. So what's unique for us about that is, unlike Central City Concern, we're not mental health providers. We're not doing the mental health ourselves. We really rely on partnerships to make that happen. And in some ways, what that means is our ability to be successful at providing permanent supportive housing is connected to how well the mental health system is working and how well our residents can access those services. So as you've heard, there's some challenges with that, but we think in many cases we're doing a pretty good job. And I think it's really important for organizations who are not mental health providers and for landlords, I guess, in general, which SEPA is, to be providing supportive housing. We can't just rely on mental health organizations to take care of folks who need this supportive housing. It needs to really be a community effort. And so it's important that other organizations and other landlords become familiar and develop expertise at this work. At SEPA, we have 2 models of how we do supportive housing. The most common model that we use is around integrating supportive housing in a community that is more diverse, that has a lot of different kinds of folks living there. And an example of that is a building we finished in 2021 called Red Rock Creek Commons in Tigard. It's 48 1-bedroom units, and 12 of those apartments are connected to mental health services and housing, and are for housing people who need those services. Folks come into that housing through the Housing Authority of Washington County. They have a list of their own list because there's connecting them also to the rent subsidy that's there. And in Tigard, we're working with New Narrative or LifeWorks, most likely, as the mental health provider on site. Another model of supportive housing is the Joyce. I'm getting really distracted reading all of I'm trying not to read the chat. Sorry, I'm like double multitasking here. Okay, another model of supportive housing is the Joyce, which we're about to finish and start leasing up in downtown Portland. Yes, it has taken a minute to finish. It's 66 units of permanent supportive housing. We're really excited that we'll be opening the doors in May and people will be actually moving into that housing. It's 100% permanent supportive housing, which means as we designed and built that building, we knew that we were building it for folks who were going to need trauma-informed design and a lot of space in order to access resources. At that building on the ground floor, we have 3 providers there with us. We have the Native American Rehabilitation Association, we have Cascade AIDS Project, and Cascadia Health. And all 3 of those agencies will be providing services to the residents who live there. We also will have our own staff there, a resident services coordinator, again, focused on eviction prevention and housing stabilization. And the whole first floor is office space and community space, what we in the housing industry call non-revenue generating space. And we will also, of course, have our front door and lobby there as well. So we're pretty excited about that. We're working on another building. It's actually one in which we're just participating in as a service provider in Aloha. And that will be 54 units of permanent supportive housing, a similar model, but different partners there on site. My staff at those who provide the services, that is, are very focused on housing stability and eviction prevention. And what that means is they work closely with the residents and with property management. We contract for property management. We don't provide our own. And work closely with property management so that when issues come up that threaten somebody's tenancy, we're working with them. Our eviction rate's super low. It's like under 3%, which is really important because eviction is really traumatic. And so once somebody moves into housing, we're going to work really hard to keep them there if we can. When residents arrive with services, if there's a problem, our job is to reconnect them to the services that they came with. And if folks come and they don't have the services that they need to be successful, our job is to link them up to those services. And again, for all of the reasons that you heard today, sometimes that is challenging because the services can be hard to access. However, having relationships with direct relationships with providers and the kinds of, and being able to have weekly meetings with property management and ongoing meetings with the service providers that we're partnering with can make a really big difference. When housing is successful for somebody who has been outside for a very long time, obviously it is transformational for that person. Some of the reasons you've already heard Scott talk about in terms of what they're offering with their transitional housing, some of those same kinds of things you receive also with permanent housing, which is a safe place to be, a place to avoid the trauma, to have a door that locks. So those are the obvious things, but there's all these other things as well, like having a refrigerator that you can keep healthy food in, that you can prepare yourself, having a place to store your medication that can make a really big difference. Had a resident once who was unable to keep his nebulizer, so he was constantly going in and out of the emergency room. And it wasn't until he moved into permanent housing that he was able to stay out of the emergency room. Also, seeing people reconnect with family is amazing. When you have a place that you can invite your family over to visit, that can make a really big difference in somebody's life. At SEPA, we see our job in this arena as building safe, stable, and trauma-informed housing and supporting residents so that they can stay there as long as they like. Sometimes folks are coming right from off the street. Sometimes they may be coming from a program that's more transitional in nature. At SEPA, it's important for us to have those partnerships and the resources in the community so that our residents have what they need to be successful and to stay housed. So that's my little spiel on permanent supportive housing.
Well, thanks, Rachel. That's great. That's great. Thank you for your work and thank you for that explanation. It's really exciting to hear about the hard work you're doing to help vulnerable people in our community. Hey, let's do some question and answer. I've got one question from Margaret Noel, and Scott answered a little bit of it in the chat, but let's answer this because I think this is super interesting. Is where and this is for Rachel and Scott. Jill and I don't know anything about this stuff. Where does the money come from? Rachel, would you talk about money that comes from the government? And Scott, would you talk after that? Would you talk a little bit more about how private individuals and private foundations are supportive, not just of Blanchet, but all kinds of organizations?
Well, I want to say that Red Rock Creek Commons that I just talked about a minute ago, that's in Tigard, has 15 different funding sources. So it comes from a lot of places, which is actually kind of a pain because it means that you can't just get money from 1, 2, or 3 places. It's one of the reasons that affordable housing is so difficult to build because you have to layer all this money on top of each other. There's all these different funding cycles that you are responsible to. So it can take quite a while. But the biggest funder of affordable housing in our community is actually the IRS. Isn't that odd? It's the tax credit program, and that is coming through the IRS. It's funds that the state allocates those resources. And then there's additional kinds of resources that come in at the same time. Some of them are federal funds that the local communities pass on to housing developers like community partners and others. We're so lucky to have the 2 bond projects, the one that was adopted by the city of Portland in, I think that was like 2017 or 2016. It was like, I just remember it was the same year that Trump got elected. So it was kind of I remember that party. No one knew exactly how to feel. So that was an important bond, and paying for the Joyce Hotel, which is awesome. And then there was a second bond that was passed regionally, and SEPA has been able to build 4 new buildings. We're actually about to break ground on one in Tualatin, and then we have 3 coming up that will be also partially funded by those bond funds. And so that is also local funds like that are huge because there's not enough money coming through the tax credit program or the state to really take care of the actual needs that exist in our community.
Thanks, Rachel. Scott, tell us about private donations. How does that work?
Well, Jason, if you write a check and make it out to Blanchet House and put it in the mail, that's exactly how it works. Or you can donate online, but I'm not here to fundraise. For 71 years, Blanchet House has been able to do what it's done because people donate to us. Now, I mean, part of it is that about 95% of the food that we serve is donated. And so that's food, last year, nearly 400 tons of food that may have gone to the landfill from restaurants, grocery stores, wholesalers, comes to Blanchet House. We serve about 300,000 meals plus with that. And then what's great about having a farm is that we can collect all of our food scraps and food waste, and we send it to the farm and they cook it into slop and they feed the pigs and other animals with that. And so we're proud of being really a zero food waste. But I think it raises the question, because people ask me, do we not receive government funding? Is that sort of a stance that we're taking that we don't want it? And the answer is yes, no, and sort of. The truth is that the services that we do and many other nonprofits in our community provide don't always qualify for public funding. There are a lot of different public funding buckets, and sometimes your services doesn't really connect to one of those buckets. And for whatever reason, hot prepared meals has never really been supported by public funding. We could get into a long conversation about, maybe the patriarchal nature of that, but I think that's left for another conversation. But, in our transitional housing, because it's a high bar program, that is, it's not a low barrier or no barrier program. We do have criteria for admittance. We also do not qualify. But here's another way of looking at it. Government funding is a pain. I look at some of the applications and the processes that you have to go through to get it, and then all the hoops that you have to jump through once you have it, and the reporting that you have to do, which doesn't always really connect to what you're doing and the services you're providing and the outcomes. I see Jill nodding. And then they change the rules on you. So it's a football game that never ends, but every quarter there are new rules. And, frankly, we just don't have the staff. I'd have to hire people just to deal with that. And that just doesn't seem like the way that I want to spend money. So yes, raising money from individuals and businesses, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy. And would it be great to not have to do that because we had more dependable sources of funding, perhaps from government? Maybe. But it also kind of allows us to do things the way that we want. And so we can be very nimble, and organizations like us can be very nimble and responsive. And sometimes when there's a lot of public funding, it can bog you down. And I don't mean to suggest that programs that do receive a lot of public funding aren't doing great work, and they are. And I give them all the credit of the world because I know the headaches that they're dealing with to receive that funding, and yet they're still doing extraordinary work.
Well, you clearly are, and because the generosity for 70 plus years has kept you going, it's an amazing human trait, generosity. It's really complete. Hey, Scott, are there? The two-part question. First is Blanche House just for men?
So our meal program serves everybody. So that's not restricted to men, of course. And the services that go along with that. But our housing programs are both single gender, so they are for men. Dual gender programs don't always work unless you can really, keep people safe. And I think certainly for women who are often struggling with houselessness and other issues because of a history of domestic violence, that being in the same space of men can be very threatening and triggering. We would like to build, in fact, we have plans, at least on paper, to do a program like we're doing for women. And we certainly want to work with our partners like Central City Concern and Catholic Charities and others in the community, because we don't have enough programs for women in our community. And certainly one of the things that we're talking with a great program in our community called Women First, about a transitional program for women that we would partner with them on, and particularly for women who have been incarcerated. If you look at the data, women who have been incarcerated, especially Black women, African-American women who have been incarcerated, they're at the bottom of just about every measure you can have in terms of social well-being. And there aren't enough services for people with those experiences. So it's an excellent question. And it's something I think as a community, we really need to be mindful of the services that are needed for women.
Thanks, Scott. Now, Jill, would you tell us about programs that are available just for women who are coming off the streets?
Well, it's been a minute since I've been.
Rachel, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you can pick your brain.
It's women coming directly off the streets. Well, I think that there's a few different. I mean, anybody who's going to detox is getting channeled, especially in Hooper, is going to get channeled to other, not just Central City Concern programs, but possibly NARA, possibly we have Fora Health out here now. There actually are a few. Fora is what used to be DePaul. It's a big, brand new, beautiful facility. I was just there the other night, and so as always, it's not enough. I mean, it's just not enough. And historically, there've been less services for women, but it's like shelters. There's always less shelters for women, which I've never understood either. But
well, then speak about for a moment about the special needs that women have, because they are particularly vulnerable and particularly harmed by this experience. And what does it take for women to exit homelessness?
Well, I think one of the reasons why there's less services for women is that women tend to hook up with some man to provide a place to stay or whatever. And there's, of course, a lot of trauma that's going to go along with that, because they're not hooking up with the guy because he's the most, the best catch in the world. They're just hooking up with him because they need somewhere to be. So unfortunately, that habit can be a hard habit to break as well. And the other thing about addiction, personally, I believe at the core of addiction for a lot of people is low self-esteem. And so a lot of women tend to seek out men to build their self-esteem. So a woman in early recovery unfortunately is going to seek out the company of a man, and vice versa. So it's always been a challenge. It was a challenge in our program, because it was men and women, it wasn't exclusive. And one of the conditions that we would put on people is no hooking up in the program, which, wasn't.
Get a dog.
It was a challenge. I remember the old Hooper, and everybody would get together in the smoke room that they had. And guys and gals would say, hey, let's get out of here. And they'd leave together. And it was really unsuccessful. So that's changed. There's definitely separate facilities for men and women because, we're vulnerable and we don't feel good about ourselves. And I don't know, most buildings are men and women combined, not inpatient treatment, but, supportive housing in all the programs is, and it is a challenge. And, so we try to steer women to women's meetings where they can hang out with other women and not be preyed upon, because there's a lot of predatory behavior that goes on. And, there's been a couple of really scary situations in the past involving, unfortunately, it seemed like women weren't very supportive either. I had a client years ago who, got a restraining order and the guy would literally stand across the street and stare at her. She was scared to death and she'd call the police and there was nothing he could do. There was nothing they could do because he was, within a certain number of feet, and she had to just leave and go to Alaska to get away from the guy. So I really think that we do not get the protection that we need. And I don't know what the answer for that is either.
I'm going to go back to Rachel. What do you think, Rachel?
What would I add to that? A couple things. One, obviously women are more vulnerable to being raped and sexually assaulted than men are, although some men with special needs who are very vulnerable can also be very traumatized and assaulted on the street. So I don't want to belittle that at all. Women tend to, most women who are homeless have experienced domestic violence. And that creates a lot of other stuff. When I was working in a program that was really focused more on self-sufficiency, it was for folks who'd been kind of in housing for quite a while. And I hate that word self-sufficiency because it is kind of a myth that any of us are really self-sufficient, and we all have dependencies, I think, on other people and systems. But one of the challenges we have is I think women have historically seen each other as competition sometimes, and so creating connections between women who may feel unsafe can be really hard, and I think important to do. And I want to just say, I think when we were talking earlier this week, we met Scott was talking about folks leaving the Blanchet House and walking to Rosehaven together. That you were saying that, not making that up. Someone was saying that. And that's a great example of a very grassroots organization that serves women right now who are still homeless and are on the street. And so those are really, really important resources for all the reasons we just said.
A couple of years ago, a rich fella gave me a bunch of money to do something. And I said, well, we'll buy a house for women coming out of prison who are in recovery. We bought an Oxford house. And it's really been an amazing experience. Really one of the more satisfying experiences in my career is just watching these women get well is just amazing because it doesn't take much. It just takes a little safety and a little time, and a lot of people can get well. It's seeing someone recover is amazing, and seeing a woman who's coming out of jail whose alternatives is to hit the streets is get well is fantastic. Margaret asks another really good question I'm not qualified to answer at all, is what about services for teenagers who are homeless in Portland? Does anybody feel qualified? That sounds like a whole other episode.
Well, I worked at Outside In for a few years, really long time ago. And Outside In and New Avenues for Youth and Janus Youth are all programs in Portland that support kids who are homeless. And actually, Outside In has expanded to, I think, Clackamas County as well, which is important. I also want to say there's an amazing organization in Washington County and Beaverton called Home Plate that also serves homeless youth. Kids have really different needs than adults, and it's generally accepted that the best thing to do is to keep them out of the adult system and to really serve them in the youth system and to help them gain the independence that that they need to be successful adults. And you know, a lot of the young people in who are being served in the homeless youth system are there. There's a high prevalence of folks who are LGBTQ because they have been kicked out by their parents. So a higher percentage there than like in just the general population of kids. And then a lot of kids, and I think this is true also in the adult community, who are exiting foster care or who left foster care because it was really not a great place for them as well. So, but those are all organizations that specialize in supporting young people, which is really, really important because we really want folks to become successful adults without entering the homeless system for adults.
Comments from Jill or Scott?
I want to just share a little happy story. When you were talking about women coming out of prison, when I was still working for CCC, there was a program for women coming out of prison that I wasn't necessarily associated with, but if somebody relapsed, then they sent them to me. And so this woman had relapsed and they sent her to me. And she had never worked a day in her life. She was a little bit of a princess. She had her nails done, and you know, she was funny. We have the Clean and Safe program, right, with Central City Concern, where people push the bucket around and they pick up trash and feces and everything else. I mean, it's really not a glamorous job, but it's a job. And she was telling her friends, I'm going to work for Clean and Safe. And they were incredulous. You're going to work for Clean and Safe? And she said, yes, I am. It's a job and they're willing to give me a chance and I'm going to do it. And she pushed that bucket around and she did a hell of a job and people noticed what a good job she was doing and she became a janitor. Long story short, she's had a couple of other jobs in between. She's got a number of years clean and she is now the supervisor of the Clean and Safe program. And it's just so awesome to me to see these success stories. She's just living a great life, has a nice big house she's buying and a car and dogs, and she's just doing great. It's awesome.
Great. Recovery is amazing. We should also point out that people of color have special challenges and barriers around homelessness and getting services and getting access to good health care, getting access to housing, getting access to social services. Just in the last couple of years, just really since George Floyd, there's been a huge amount of attention and money around this issue. Scott, can you speak a little bit about this, about what's going on for BIPOC people?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think there's a lot of great things in our community. In fact, Central City Concern just opened a new program that is really going to support in culturally specific ways members of our BIPOC community. And you know, I think it's important. I'm going to suppose, because people who are taking the time to be here tonight are probably informed about these issues, but systemic racism and systemic poverty and transgenerational racism and poverty and trauma are all very real. And it is something where you're dealing with multi-generations of extreme poverty, of extreme discrimination, of racial abuse. And this it plays a part, a real significant part in a person's houselessness, in their trauma, in their ability to receive services. What it takes to receive services is trust. Because again, we're talking about a community that is used to being lied to, abused, disappointed, shamed, and judged for things that they need or things that they ask for. And so for people who are in our BIPOC community and our LGBTQ plus community, it's certainly the services that we can provide, where we can create that trust, that we see them as human beings and that we are sensitive to their difference, and that we do privilege equity and fairness, can go a long way for them believing that they can receive help and that the help can make a difference. But there are so many different demographics in our community, and they don't all need the same things. We were just talking about youth. We don't see a lot of youth at Blanchet House, but boy, we serve a lot of people who are elderly and who are physically disabled. And I know when I talk to my friends at the Northwest Pilots Project that focuses on seniors and helping seniors with housing, you know, the fear out there is a growing community of older houseless people with dementia and Alzheimer's. And it's a frightening concept. And so layer that on top of mental illness and all the other traumas and horrors that we're dealing with. It's just for all of these groups, to go back to Margaret's question, there's just not enough. And Jason's already pointed out that in almost every category, Oregon is at the bottom of the list in terms of services and opportunities for help. But we're also at the top of a lot of lists when it comes to need, and that's a perfect storm. And it's going to take a lot of time, and you know, it's going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of patience, because the progress that we make is not always going to be visible, and it's certainly not going to be linear. Even when we're working with people with addiction, their journey is not linear. They have relapses and they have struggles along the way, and sometimes it makes it difficult to measure success. I'll just stop there.
I think we should need to also just note that there's other, and Scott, you're mentioning a lot of different communities, just to name a few of them. People who have hard time accessing mental health and addiction services, and therefore hard time accessing housing. And those are people like folks with intellectual disorders, people who have immigration, don't have the right immigration status, people who don't speak English, as Scott said, people who are seniors, and as Rachel spoke about, people who are youth, people who are of color, and even people who come from frontier counties who have grown up outside of cities, have a really hard time navigating our social service system. It's kind of on a bell curve, and that bell curve is pretty sharp, and that bell curve is really designed by people who are white, who are educated, who are middle class, and it works best for those sorts of people because it's designed by those sorts of people. The measure being taken just in the last couple of years is to insert a lot of people of color into the service system to get them started into the workforce. We have a new head of mental health for the state who's an African-American woman. She ran, her name is Ebony Clark. She ran the Multnomah County's mental health system and rave reviews, a very respected and admired person, and very optimistic about Ebony and her ability to lead the state. And I'm looking forward to new leaders up and down. We have just a few minutes left. I want to get to some of these other questions. Carolyn asks, and I'm just going to read her question. If I am a 50-year-old man who is evicted, who is broke and has mental health issues, where can I go for help? Or should I just move into a tent? I'm going to ask Scott to answer that question.
So hopefully you don't have to move into a tent. And the thing is this is why we really need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help people stay in their housing. Because once someone is unsheltered, and the longer they're unsheltered, the harder it is to rehouse them and to rehouse them effectively. And so you hope that the answer, that the only recourse is a tent or being unsheltered or living in your car. You know, I think somebody put in the chat some services. I mean, without naming, you know, the services that are available, I do want to let everybody know about Street Roots, which is an amazing organization in our community. Have the Rose City Guide, which is available online. And it's a great resource for finding all kinds of services. I think it's a little bit easier to navigate than perhaps 211, although that is another resource. But without answering the question directly, I mean, I think we have to emphasize that we really need to put as much power behind keeping people housed as we can, and enough resources to keep people housed. Because if we don't do that, then we're never going to be able to solve for this problem.
I want to answer Donna Cohen's question and invite the panelists, if they dare, to get political. And the question is, do you feel optimistic with Governor Kotek in office? And Donna writes, she seems to be more focused on putting resources into housing and also substance abuse programs. And I'll say, yes, I am really encouraged by Governor Kotek's first talks, the people she's hired, and her general deportment around these particular issues. However, I've been excited by every Democratic governor as the first days that they've been in office. And so what do our panelists think? Encouraged, optimistic, things looking better?
Well, I'm encouraged that you're optimistic, Jason, so that makes me feel better. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to choose to be optimistic, and also optimistic about Chair Vega Peterson, who I think both the chair and the governor, I think they want to turn urgency into action. I'm going to quote the chair there, because that's what we need to do. The situation is urgent, and we need to turn that urgency into action to save lives and to help people find a better way to live. And so we're all about hope at Blanchet House, and so I'm going to choose to be hopeful.
Great. Thanks to the panelists. Thank you for participating. It's been great. Debbie, take us out.
Thank you all very, very much. You are excellent speakers, and it was a stimulating and informative discussion. Each of you offered such valuable and insightful experiences and learning, describing current achievements, ongoing challenges, and future pathways for increased success. Personally, you've given me some hope that we can make progress in these very, very demanding areas. We appreciate the critically important work that you do to address these vital and urgent issues, urgent as we've just said. And thank you very much for your service and your dedication. The League of Women Voters is an organization that exists to empower civic engagement. Of course, I'd like to remind viewers and listeners about the importance of voting in the upcoming May 16th special election. We will have lots of nonpartisan information for voters on our lwvpdx.org website this month before voters receive your ballots. The League voter education resources will include candidate interviews on video and podcast, mock elections for middle and high school students, as well as the excellent nonpartisan website, vote411.org. If you are not yet registered to vote, the last day to register for this election is Tuesday, April 25th. Ballots will be mailed starting the following day and must be postmarked now by May 16th to be counted. Thanks again to members of the League of Women Voters of Portland for their generous support. As a reminder, links to view this program will be posted on our website, lwvpdx.org, and available on various platforms, as well as in podcasts. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We welcome you to join us, and will also value your financial support in presenting these and other relevant programs. Please see the membership and donor information on our website. Thank you again, panelists, for sharing your knowledge with all of us on this serious, important, and yes, urgent topic in our community. Good night.